have our Thursday forms series today. Last week I was MIA, so we were going to cover the backup offer addendum last week. We'll be covering that this week, as well as the DID form. So the DID form is the increased deposit form. So let's start with that one, just because I currently, you should be able to see my screen. I currently have the residential purchase agreement pulled up. And you'll see here in the grid in section D, you have your initial deposit amount, which we all know customary for the area is 1%. You can always increase that initial deposit, just so you know, to try to be more competitive. You can increase it. It doesn't matter really, truly, if you increase it higher than 3%, because in most cases we sign the liquidated damages clause in the contract, which limits what the seller can go after the buyer for in the instance of a breach of contract at 3% or the deposit, whichever is less. Okay, so that's kind of where that initial deposit falls into place. You really don't want to go 3%, over 3% there. And as a secondary option on D2, we have an increased deposit. And this is for money placed in escrow after the initial deposit. That's going to count towards that deposit number. So you would use form DID at time the increased deposit is made. So you would check this box here. So like on our example, we have a deposit of $5,000, and maybe we want to do an increased deposit in an effort to make our offer more appealing. And maybe our increased deposit would come into play when we removed our contingencies. Maybe it would come into play once our property that the buyer is selling gets put on the market, or maybe it's when it goes into contract, right? There's lots of different, maybe it's after 10 days of escrow, regardless of what happens in the contract. So there's so many options of how this increased deposit can come into play. It's a strategic thing. And again, if our buyers and sellers have agreed or are going to agree to the liquidated damage clause, D1 and D2 don't need to total more than 3%. It's just fluff at that point, because if we totaled 5% here, we've got 0.83 there. So let's say that we're going to do an increased deposit of $20,000. So now our increased deposit's 3% of the contract price. We have another 0.83%. We're close to 4% of the contract price in increased deposits. And it defaults to, we're going to give this increased deposit upon removal of contingencies, or a specific date would be here. So maybe on the 19th, or this is where you can fill in something else, like 10 days after acceptance or whatever there, right? So maybe we're going to say, hey, on the 19th of October, there's a special day there. Who knows what it is? We're going to do an increased deposit of $20,000. Our total here is 4%. If our buyers breached contract, the seller would only be able to keep 3% of that deposit, not the entire deposit. Because if we all agree to the liquidated damage clause, it is either 3% or actual deposit, whichever is less. Okay. Now, on that note as well, if your buyer, sometimes what happens is when the buyer goes to wire their funds to the title company for their deposit, there's a fee associated with that. It's like $35 or $50 or whatever their bank wants to charge them to wire funds. So sometimes they may be like, well, I don't want to get charged $35 now and $35 in 10 days. Can I wire the entire amount now? Absolutely. They can send $25,000 over to escrow today. Initially, only $5,000 of that's going to count towards the increased deposit, or towards the actual deposit. Once we hit the 19th, then we want to fill out this DID form. Or if they only deposited $5,000 at the beginning, now they're coming back in with their $20,000 on the 19th. Then we want to use, that's where this DID form comes into play. So now let's go find the DID form. This is our delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages addendum. And this, again, it's to be used at time increased deposit is paid, not with offer or counter offer. So we wouldn't use this at time of offer. We wouldn't use this in response to a counter offer. This is only on the day that that increased deposit comes into play as part of the contract. Okay. The following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated into the purchase agreement. And then it's got other, for the most part, it's going to be purchase agreement, but it could be, who knows what you might reference there. Even if it's on a counter offer, you could still reference the purchase agreement. This date here is the date in the upper left-hand corner of the first page of that residential purchase agreement. full property address. As always, please make sure you put street, court, way, drive, whatever that is, because it could be duplicated on just the number and the name of the street. So we always want to put that suffix. Buyer's name, seller's name should go on there. Okay, at this point, does anybody have any questions about why we would use this form, how that increased deposit works before we get into the rest of this form? All right, and I do have the chat box open, so if somebody's on mute, you don't want to unmute yourself, I do have the chat box open, as well as you can feel free at any time just to unmute yourself and interrupt me. All right, the seller, oh, right here, between buyer and seller. Buyer and seller are referred to as parties. That's the end of that first section. Then we have section 1. By depositing on, remember, so our increased deposit was on the 19th, the sum of $5,000. So this is where you would put that increased deposit amount. So the increased deposit was $20,000. And how are the initial one? It auto-populated, sorry. It with 5,000. So that's the initial deposit. So by depositing on blank, the sum of $5,000. Hold on, let me just double check. Payable to buyer hereby increases. Oh, no, I was right the first time. That's what I thought. And then I read it and thought, did they change it? All right, so you're going to put the increased deposit amount here. So on the 19th of October, we're depositing $20,000. How are we depositing it? Is it cash, cashier's check, personal check, wired funds? Just so you know, your title company, it's not going to take cash. So never instruct your buyers to give cash, but they could do wired funds, personal check, or cashiered check. Say those are all appropriate options, or it could be electronic check would be here. So if they're going to use the title company's app where they do an electronic check versus the actual like ACH transfer, like electronic wired funds, then it would be electronic check. Okay, there. Okay, and then payable to title company, here's where you would put the title company's name. Buyer hereby increases the total deposit to blank, right? So we started with a $5,000 deposit. We're adding $20,000. So our total deposit is now $25,000. We're going to add those two deposits together. Okay, that's how we fill out section 1. So the increased deposit goes at the top. How they're going to make that deposit goes in the middle, title company's name, and then the total deposit when we add it all together. Okay. Section 2, if buyer and seller have agreed to the liquidated damages in the agreement, the following liquidated damage provision is hereby incorporated in and made part of this addendum. If they didn't agree to the liquidated damage clause, then we would check the little box that says is not. Okay, the liquidated damage provision is not hereby incorporated in and made part of this addendum. For the most part, most of our buyers and sellers agree to that. There's a lot of benefits to it on both sides of the spectrum. Just so you know, from the buyer's standpoint, it limits the amount that seller can go after them for in case of breach of contract. And on the seller side of it, it predetermines the amount the sellers get to keep in case of breach of contract, which means they don't have to go fight over whether they get to keep $100 or $1,000 or 3% or the actual deposit. It already specifies what the sellers get to keep if they breach contract. So there is benefits on both sides of the spectrum. Okay. If buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damage the deposit actually paid. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which is buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision, or arbitration award. Okay, so on our cancellation form, there's a section on the top for the cancellation of contract. The section on the bottom specifies what happens to that deposit. Also, please keep in mind too that this liquidated damage provision, if you notice, it only applies to residential properties up to 4 units where the buyer actually intends to owner occupy one of those units. Okay, if a non-owner occupied property, if it's an investment property or has more than 4 units, you probably want to seek legal counsel as to what the sellers would be able to retain. Okay. The undersigned have read and acknowledged the receipt of this increased deposit, liquidated damage, addendum, seller signs, buyer signs. Buyer has given the additional deposit to broker who acknowledges receipt of the additional deposit. So if the deposit was given to, in some states, the deposit's given to the broker rather than the title company. In California, for the most part, we just give the deposit. We don't touch buyer's money. Please don't touch buyer's money. Just send them directly to the title company. Do not pass go. Do not hand me money. Just give it to the title company is our theme and should be your theme when it comes to other people's money. Okay. If the buyer gives it to you not to hold, this is only if you're going to hold it. So what often happens is, like in Colorado, for instance, the deposit's given to the broker holds it in the broker's trust account. And then when they go to balance out the net sheet at the end, that deposit counts towards the commission due to the broker. So it reduces from their commission. Anyways, it's really a mess, in my opinion. I like that it all goes to the title company. So we only use this if it's actually going to be held by the broker. If the buyer hands you a check to give to the title company, we wouldn't check this box. We would get it to the title company. But keep in mind that if the buyer hands you money to give to the title company, you have to log that in our trust account records. So you need to call up Carly in the office and say, hey, I received a check. I'm going to send you a picture of it in the amount of $20,000 made out to Old Republic Title Company. It's currently in my possession. I will let you know when I hand it off to the title company, because once we touch their money, we have to have a written record of that in our trust account, even if it doesn't get deposited in our actual trust account. Okay, so anytime you touch money, I think I've told everybody this before, but I'll tell you again in case you weren't there. I used to pick up the buyer's closing package from title and take it to the buyer to give to them with their keys. Oftentimes, 99.99999% of the time, in the buyer's closing package is a check, because usually the buyer brings more money to the table than they actually need to close the transaction to make sure that we're covered. Title issues a check in the overage of what was needed to close and what the buyers actually gave. So in that closing package is a check, which means that if I touch that closing package to go give it to the buyers when keys are being delivered, I need to log that check into our trust account. I need to let them know that, hey, I've got a check in my possession. It's in the amount of, it's made out to, and I'm going to go deliver it to them. I'll let you know once it's delivered, because we have to have that chain of ownership, or chain of who's got it, right? Custody, chain of custody is what I was looking for. Okay. And if it's being held by the broker, then the broker would sign this bottom. If you're not retaining the buyer's money, so 99% of the time in our area, you're not going to take the buyer's check and hold the buyer's check, we aren't going to fill out this bottom section down here with the real estate broker information. Okay, any questions about this DID, the delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damage addendum? Okay, and again, buyers can send all their money to title at any time during the transaction. It doesn't make it available for the seller to take if they breach contract. It just may make it easier. Like, hey, instead of just sending over the deposit, I'm sending over everything, or I'm sending over the deposit and the increased deposit on day one. But we wouldn't fill out this form if we have an increased deposit until it's actually time to bring those funds into alignment with that increased deposit. Up until that point, this money's off limits from the seller. Okay. Everybody good? The other form, everybody's so quiet today. The other form that we have is our backup offer addendum. So this is the one that I was going to cover last week. So I'm going to cover it this week instead. This one comes into play in like a multiple offer situation. Multiple offers were received, or maybe the property is already in contract, and we want our buyers to be in a position, they really like this house. We know you already accepted another contract, but in the case something happens, we want to be the ones that are going to complete that purchase for you. This solidly locks the buyers into that position, into whatever position that we put them in. So it could be like a backup offer number 1, number 2, number 3. So you could have like 4 accepted backup offers. Okay. In a slower market, this might be good. In a right for the sellers to make sure they've got somebody in line. Adriana, did you have a question?
No, sorry.
That's fine. I just saw that you were unmuted, so I thought I should pause and wait and make sure. Right. So if sometimes this comes into play as a benefit to the seller, especially in the slower market, because we've already got somebody on the line to follow through. It also makes it a lot easier if you've got somebody in backup offer position and you've got a buyer that's currently being really shady or not completing their actions. Sometimes it's hard for a seller to want to cancel out on them, and then we continue to let them railroad us and drag us on and on and on, like weeks down the road. But if we have a backup offer in place, it makes it a lot easier to say, hey, I talked to the backup offer, the agent for the backup offer, those backup buyers, they're still ready to move forward. So let's go ahead and serve this notice to perform, because these buyers have just been dragging us along. They keep telling they're going to remove contingencies. They haven't done it. Let's serve that notice and prepare to move forward with our backup offer, right? So it gives us the ability to be able to do that from the listing point of view. From a buyer's point of view, it locks our buyers into that property so that the seller can't turn and go with somebody else. If something happens with their current escrow, then they are obligated to move forward with the buyer in backup offer position number one. Now, in a really hot market, right, where you've got multiple offers coming in, I usually don't recommend that we actually put anybody in backup offer position. And the reason being, from the listing point of view, the reason being is that I can put that property back on the market and get another 5 or 6 offers, and maybe even drive the price higher than we were initially in contract for, versus locking myself into the second best offer on the initial round, right? So it gives you some options there if we don't actually officially put somebody into backup. So if we're in a situation where there's like multiple offers going on in a situation, it's a hot market, that's where I would usually reach out to the agents, let them know that, hey, we accepted a different offer. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to make sure I keep your information. If anything starts to go a little crazy with this escrow, we will be in touch, right? And just let them know that, hey, it's preparing to come back on the market, but I may not solidify somebody into that position. From a buyer's point of view, you oftentimes want to be locked in if it's a property they really like. Okay. And this also gives you the option. There's 2 ways this form can be used. One is we submitted multiple offers. Our offer wasn't accepted. The seller sends us back a backup offer addendum to lock us into that backup offer position. The second option is, hey, I know this property is already in contract, but my buyers really like it and they would like to be in backup offer position in case something goes crazy. So we're going to submit an offer, and you can submit the offer with this backup offer addendum attached to the actual offer. So there's a couple different ways this can be used. Like I said, either a response from the seller or with the initial offer, depending on the situation. Okay. There is a place for this on the residential purchase agreement. There's a place for it on the counter offer as well. But when we look at, here is the acceptance of the offer for the sellers. They have the option to either do a seller counter offer, to respond with a backup offer addendum, right? So they could say, hey, we're accepting this with the backup offer addendum. So we're accepting your offer, but you're in backup offer position number 1, 2, or 3, right? So there's always that ability there for the sellers to respond. And then just checking, if the buyers were submitting the offer with the backup offer addendum, then what we would want to do is just finding the little section up here in the residential purchase agreement, up here where we have all of our addendums and advisories. You've got other addendums here. You could check this box in section B, the backup offer addendum. So if we were submitting an offer with a backup offer addendum, we would check this box under section 4B for backup offer addendum. And that officially incorporates it into the purchase agreement. And if the seller is responding with a backup offer addendum, they can do it either on, if they were countering any terms of this offer, they would counter it just like a regular counter. They could include the backup offer addendum as part of the counter. Or if they were accepting the offer as is, but putting the buyer into backup position, then here in section 33A is where they would check the box for backup offer addendum. Okay, so that's how this form gets incorporated into our purchase. And then let me scroll back down. All right, here's our backup offer addendum. The addendum, this is an addendum to the purchase agreement or counter offer number or other. So for the most part, it's either going to be an addendum to the purchase agreement or an addendum to the counter offer. Okay, if it's an addendum to the counter offer, we would check the box and put, is it counter offer number 1, number 2, number 3, what counter offer is it in response to? And notice it doesn't Specify whether it's a multiple counter offer or a buyer counter offer or a seller counter offer. Okay. You're always going to put the date here on the next line. So of course, if it's a purchase agreement, it would be the date in the upper left-hand corner, the first page of that residential purchase agreement. If you're referencing a form that doesn't have a date on the top of the page, then it would be the date that it was signed by the party submitting that form. Okay. The property known as, again, put the complete address. You're going to put the buyer's names here and the seller's names here. Okay, and that completes the top, just like just about every other form that we fill out. That's how the top goes. Buyer and seller are referred to as parties. Okay, section number 1. The agreement is in backup position number blank and is contingent upon written cancellation of any prior contracts and related escrow, prior transactions between seller and other buyers, and mutual release of the obligation to buy, sell, or exchange that property. Seller and other buyers may mutually agree to modify or amend terms in the prior transaction. So here is where you would put, are we in backup offer position number 1, number 2, number 3? Okay, we have to move forward with buyers in the position in which they sit in backup offer position. Please keep in mind this paragraph also, again, just stated that, hey, we have to provide written cancellation that the other buyers have been canceled or that the other buyers canceled themselves, one or the other. I would also, just so you know, if I was provided this, I'd probably ask for proof that that notice to perform was served if it's the seller canceling on those buyers. And then mutual release, right? So it's saying here that, hey, the seller and other buyers, the buyers that are currently in contract, they don't have to move forward with the contract as accepted. They can modify it, right? They can do an AEA and change the terms, change financing, extend the close of escrow, extend the timeframes for contingency removals. Like they can modify that agreement as much as they want to. Okay. Any questions about section number 1? All right, section 2, cancellation rights for buyer. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing at any time before seller provides buyer copies of written cancellation and releases of prior transactions signed by all parties on to those contracts. Okay, so at any time during this backup offer addendum is in place, our buyer can cancel this contract. Okay, they just have to do it in writing. Hey, we no longer want to move forward. We're not going to wait any longer. We're done. Okay, so they can cancel. Once they are served notice that the other buyers, the primary buyers, have canceled, and now this backup offer addendum is moved into place, if there are no contingencies in that contract or anything, the buyers are officially in contract and moving forward with that property. And so they would only be able to cancel based on the stipulations in the residential purchase agreement. Okay. For buyer or seller, if seller is unable to provide such written side cancellation and releases to buyer by blank date, then either party may cancel this agreement in writing, right? How long do you want to give the seller to provide that information? Maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's 3 days, maybe it's the end of the contingency period. You're going to pick a date. I'm just going to throw 10/31 on there. It's the end of the month. Today's the 12th. That gives them 2.5 weeks to sit around and wait. Once this expires, it doesn't necessarily remove these buyers from backup offer position number 1. Okay, just like our contingencies, this still rolls forward, but now either the buyer or the seller could cancel this agreement. So the buyers are really no longer locked in because now my sellers have a right to say, hey, we're canceling this backup offer addendum. We got a better offer and we're going to move forward with the other offer. So it's in your buyer's best interest that if this is going to expire and your buyers still want to hang out and wait, there's still hope that they may be able to purchase this property. The other buyers may fall out, to do an extension of time for this deadline right here. Okay, buyer's deposit, it's section 3. Buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow holder within 3 business days after the copy of written cancellations and releases signed by all parties to the prior transaction are provided to buyer, or if checked, shall immediately be handled as provided in the agreement. So the default is that the deposit is due 3 days after the seller provides us proof that the prior transaction has been canceled. Okay, if we want the deposit due right away to say, hey, we're serious about moving forward with this property, we will even put a deposit in escrow. We would check this box here, and then it would be due as in the residential purchase agreement, which is usually 3 business days from acceptance. Okay, any questions so far? The next section is time periods. Time periods in the agreement for investigations, contingencies, covenants, and other obligations shall begin on the day after seller provides buyers copies of signed cancellation and releases of prior transactions. So option number 1 is, hey, seller provides cancellations. That becomes day 0. Our time frames start the next day. Okay. Or 2, if checked, all time periods shall begin as provided in the agreement. However, if the date for the close of escrow is a specified calendar date, and that date shall not be extended unless agreed to in writing by the buyer and the seller. Okay, so here is all time periods begin as provided in the agreement. So that would be, hey, once this is signed, that counts as acceptance, and we start all time periods right then and there. The default is it starts once we get cancellation instructions. Okay. Section number 5, scope of broker duty. The parties agree that no real estate broker or agent involved in this transaction has advised either party whether the prior transaction was legally canceled or if that party is legally entitled to the deposit. Okay, just saying that, hey, we don't know. We're not experts. Like, it's really between the seller and the other buyers if they've canceled it, whether they legally did that or not. We actually had one this last week that was had a backup offer addendum in place, served a notice to perform, and didn't quite understand how that notice to perform worked. They canceled the contract illegally because it was prior to the notice of performance date, because we had a weekend and a holiday this week. So it wasn't canceled legally. We don't want to get our current buyers in trouble, so we may want to advise them to seek legal counsel. Expiration is number 6. If this backup offer is attached to a purchase agreement or counter offer, it expires with that other document. Otherwise, this backup offer shall be deemed revoked unless signed and delivered back to the party initiating by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after it is signed by the seller. By signing below, the parties acknowledge that each has read, understands, and received a copy and agrees to the terms of this agreement and this backup offer addendum. Seller sign and buyer sign there on the top. Any questions about this top section, numbers 1 through 6 of the backup offer addendum? All right. This bottom section does not get signed right away. Okay, we only sign this top section when we agree to the backup offer addendum. This bottom section is for if the original buyers cancel, or the seller cancels on the original buyers. This is the notice that gets served back to us as notice that cancellation has happened. So notice of cancellation and release of prior transaction. Seller acknowledges being advised to seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney regarding the cancellation of all prior transactions. Seller hereby delivers notice to the buyer that all prior transactions have been canceled and released. Attached hereto are copies of the signed cancellation and release of prior transaction. The agreement is now in full force and effect. Seller signs here. So at time that the seller cancels or the buyer cancels on the original contract, so at time the original contract is canceled, seller signs this and provides it back to the buyer, letting them know that, hey, you are now the buyer on this property. Down here, we acknowledge a receipt of a copy of the signed notice of cancellation and release of prior transaction form. The initials below are not required, but can be used as evidence that the initialing party has received the completed form. Buyer initials there. Okay, I highly recommend you have your buyer initial there if we're in this backup offer position, or if you're the listing agent, please request that the buyer actually initials this form so that we have proof that everybody's seen it. They understand that the buyer should be moving forward. So top section gets signed with the offer or the counter offer at time we're putting them into the backup offer position. Bottom section only gets signed and initialed if the backup offer buyer is getting put into the buyer position. Okay, makes sense to everybody? Okay, fabulous. There was something I was thinking as I was going through this. Oh, qualified California real estate attorney. Again, I've mentioned it before. I'll mention it again. It is highly beneficial for you to have relationships with 2 to 3 qualified California real estate attorneys, because this comes into play on just about every document we have. So it may be in your best interest that, you know, we talked about during the buyer transactions that I have an intro email that goes out to the buyers once we're in contract. We may want to include some contacts there for some qualified California real estate attorneys. So not only did we advise them that they should be seeking counsel as they move through all these forms, but we've also provided them with options of people to call to get the help that they need. Okay, anytime we refer somebody to a vendor or third party, we always want to refer generally in groups of 3. We want to give them choices, not just one. So we always want to give them choices. That's all I got for everybody today. Does anybody have any questions on the backup offer addendum, the increased deposit form, the delivery of increased deposit form, or any other forms? Now's your chance. Next
Amy,
week. Yeah.
Amy, I have a question.
Yes.
So when we were talking about the deposit, you mentioned we were talking about the fact that the 3% rule applies if liquidated damages is signed. So if the seller, let's say the seller decided they didn't want to sell their house anymore, buyer had already removed all of their contingencies, and the seller wanted to get out of the transaction. I was actually always under the impression that the seller had no way out of the transaction at that point. Is that not true? Is it that they would owe the 3% amount and they could cancel the sale?
No, seller actually cannot cancel the sale. The buyer's remedy for that isn't necessarily even like getting 3% back. It would actually be the buyers could sue for performance and force the sellers to sell that property. Once the sellers have signed the contract, they don't have the right to cancel the sale unless the buyers fail to perform, right? So when we look at the contingency removal form, I was just looking for it. I know it's down in this document someplace. Buyer's contingency removal. Oh, here, we want this. Yeah. So when we look at the contingency removal form, there's lots of things besides the contingencies that the buyers have to perform on in order to stay out of breach of contract. So you have those 8 contingencies that are listed, from the loan, the appraisal, the inspection, the review of leased and liened items, review of preliminary title, review of seller disclosures. But the buyer also needs to do things like perform actions that are, in fact, I should have looked at the notice to buyer perform. This would have been a better form. Hold on. See if I can get it up there. No. There we go. No, hold on. My computer's not participating in the process. It's probably me not participating in the process, but we're going to blame the computer. All right. All right. On the notice to the buyer perform, there's these contingencies, right? Those 8 contingencies that are listed. There's a 9th one if they have the sale of another property. But then there's all these other contractual actions that the buyers have to do. So if your sellers really want out of that contract, number one, they could ask the buyers and be like, hey, we were job transfer, or we were supposed to get PCS'd. Our orders just got canceled, so now we're staying here. And I'm really sorry, but we would really like to not have to move and sell our property and go buy another one, since now all of our circumstances have changed. They may want to offer some sort of compensation in order to do so. Like, hey, I'm so sorry. Like, we're willing to give you like the amount of your deposit, not just your deposit, but like double that back to you for your trouble and time. And I'm so sorry, right? Like, sometimes buyers are going to be understanding of that. So there's always that action that you could do. The other thing is now we start nitpicking the contract and we start serving notices to perform for everything on here. For the initial deposit wasn't received, the delivery of increased deposit, the signed liquidated damage clause, updated lender information if they switch lenders, the notice of FHA, VA requirements, right? So we can start nitpicking the return of all the seller signed disclosures, and we can serve that notice to perform 2 days before any of those actions are due, with the hopes that the buyer's agent delays just a hair, just enough that we could cancel that contract based on their failure to follow through on a contractual action and get those sellers out of that contract before the close of escrow. But other than that, there's
Okay,
really
perfect.
no ways to say that again.
That's what, oh no, I was just saying, okay, that's what I thought. I just, something that you had said made me think, am I wrong about that? So I wanted to clarify. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah. So sellers have a hard time canceling a contract. Once the sellers have like put their home on the market and they've agreed to sell it to somebody, the sellers are kind of stuck. It protects the buyers from the sellers just being like, oh, decided not to sell. Sorry. I know you just spent, $2,000 on inspections, but oh well, right? So it prevents them from being able to do that. Buyers can sue for specific performance in that instance if the seller started not wanting to sell the property. Any other questions? That was a good one. Make sure you log your attendance. It's in the chat box. You can click on that, log your attendance. If you want to see any future trainings, throw them in there. There's a suggestion box. Next week, we're covering the TOPA on Thursday. It has to do with the tenant occupancy of a property that's being purchased. On Tuesday, we are going to talk about putting together your business plan. We talked about this week knowing your numbers and putting together your goal for next year. And then next year, we're going to talk about building a business plan for success on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, we're going to take that and put it into a 12-week year. And I'll show you how to do that, where we kind of reevaluate every 12 weeks. And we're going to put it into what we call a GPS form, our goals, priorities, and strategy form. So that's Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday. Tuesday's at 10:30, Wednesday's at 9, and then Thursday we're going to cover the TOPA form at 9 as well. So thanks everyone. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask them. I'll stay on another couple minutes and then make sure to click that and log your attendance.